27. John 11, verses 17 through 27. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world."
I want to take the next 3 lessons to focus on some of the events that are in the latter part of Jesus' earthly life and ministry. It's interesting to me to see how the gospel writers tell us these stories. There are details in there, like Evan mentioned, about Jesus' view of spending that Last Supper with the apostles. And I don't know about you, and I don't want to go into this now, but I can't help but think that that might have been a time for real dread because of what it represented. But it was a time for Jesus to express his love for his disciples. We're going to talk this morning about a passage from John chapter 11. And as always, I'd like to do just a quick introduction to the context. The Gospel of John, the author never identifies himself by name. He refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And we infer, kind of understand, that this is the Apostle John. This is one of the, we always laugh when we think about it, but one of those men who, when he first became an apostle, follower of Jesus, was a pretty rough and ready kind of a guy. Pretty quick-tempered. Jesus nicknamed him and his brother as the sons of thunder. And I think we've all known people that are kind of like that. Yet John becomes what we know of as the apostle of love. And we see a man who, through his lifetime with Jesus, just so changes and grows and develops in ways that might have seemed unimaginable as he began. So, this gospel, this account of the life of Jesus, is different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. From what we understand, it was probably written sometime later. And that's helpful for us to kind of get a picture on because, you know, if you think about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they tell a lot of the stories about the life of Jesus. They tell a lot of the factual information. John delves a little bit deeper. It's kind of like, I always see it as, it's kind of like he's saying to us that, all right, now you have all the information you need to know about Jesus, about his life, about his disciples, about, you know, all the people he interacted with. I want to take you to a deeper level. I want to paint a grand picture of who Jesus is. And that's important. And so we have in the Gospel of John what are referred to as the 7 I am statements. where Jesus will say, I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. And we find great significance in all of these statements, and we'll see one of those in a minute. But he also gives us a close focus on the final days of Jesus' ministry. If you think about that from the point that we're starting this morning, that is close to the end of Jesus' earthly ministry. It's only months, 4 or 5 months or less, and Jesus will be crucified. And so that's kind of helpful for us to see, if you like listening to classical music, okay, I'm along here sometimes, and you like listening to the classical music, you know that some of the great pieces build up to just kind of a very, very grand section that is close before the end, and you just get so moved by that music. Well, this is that grand section. So, just briefly, kind of go through the chronology here. Chapter 9, this is in Jerusalem. This is the story about Jesus healing the man born blind. This is not Bartimaeus. This is another man. And the Pharisees, the council, investigates the healing, and there's just a whole lot of furor about that. So that then comes into chapter 10. The first part of chapter 10 is the Good Shepherd and door of the sheepfold, the two of the I ams that we talked about. But then the rest of the chapter is dealing with the unbelief that Jesus encounters among the religious leaders. And as you read some of these, it's like Jesus is just pounding his head on the wall, really, trying to get across to these people who he is and why he came. And this reaches a point where they get so mad at him, they start picking up stones to stone him, to put him to death. And so Jesus withdraws across the Jordan River. Now, John identifies that this story happens at the time of the Feast of Dedication, which would be December. And he says it's in the winter. And so you think from there to the Passover is the story that John is now, is the time frame that John is now going to expand on from the life of Jesus. And so across the Jordan, Jesus is there with his disciples, and then they receive word. Mary and Martha send word to Jesus that your friend, Lazarus, the one whom you love, and the word that's used there is the phileo. In other words, it is that close friend that he is to you, is very, very ill. And, the story here about Lazarus takes up pretty well the whole chapter. The latter part of the chapter are the kind of the after effects. But as we look at it, it's, in the Gospel of John, that's major attention to one event and its effects. And so that gives you an idea of how important this story of Lazarus really is for John, and I think for us. And so when Jesus gets word that Lazarus is sick, he does what might seem to be unexpected. If you find out that your best friend is deathly ill, what's your inclination? Isn't it kind of jump in the car? Well, obviously Jesus didn't jump in the car, but he didn't have a car to jump in. But you go there. Jesus gets word, and he doesn't go. And he sits there. And you can see the disciples just kind of scratching their heads. Well, Lazarus is sick. They say he's dying. What? And then Jesus tells his disciples that he's sick, but he's not, that this illness is not going to end in death. Which is an interesting thing to say. Because then he tells his disciples, and there's no mention of a messenger coming to tell them, or tell him, that Lazarus has fallen asleep. And his disciples are really, this is kind of an interesting part of the story, because the disciples say, oh, that's good. If he's sleeping, he's going to get better. And Jesus said, tells them, he says, no, I'm using the term sleep euphemistically. He doesn't use the word euphemistically, but that's the idea. He says, I'm using the term sleep. He's died. And can't you imagine their confusion, their consternation that you just said this is not going to end in death, and he just died? And so let us go back to Judea. So they are on the east side of the Jordan River, and they're now headed back. Thomas says, they were just wanting to stone you back in Jerusalem. Why are you wanting to go back there? And so they say, well, let's go with him so that we can die with him there. And so the word of Lazarus' death. And they head back. And as I've been reading this story this week, I have found some very interesting ideas in here, because it doesn't seem like Jesus is in any hurry to get there. How do I know that? Well, because we have elements of the story like the fact that as he is approaching, there's time for one of Lazarus' sisters to come out to meet him, to go back, and for her sister to come back and meet him. These women are traveling faster than he is. But as we come to this scene, there are different elements that I think are really interesting. There's a crowd of mourners. It says and John makes the point here that Bethany, where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived, is 2 miles from Jerusalem. And so that there's a group of Jews that have come out of Jerusalem that have come to, we would say, support Mary and Martha at this time of loss with the death of Lazarus. And so you've got a crowd there. And the reason they're there, obviously, is that they're sympathetic to the loss, but they're also curious about some of the things that are happening. And so Martha is the one that comes running out. But how does she greet Jesus? Lord, if you had been there, he would not have died. Kind of sounds like she's blaming him, doesn't it? You could have prevented this. But as Jesus talks with her, he says, your brother will rise. Okay. Yeah, I know he'll rise on the last day. She obviously does believe, as many of the average, normal Jews, not the religious leaders of the Sadducees, believes in the idea of a resurrection. She believes in something after death, but she doesn't see anything immediate with her brother. But she says, but I know that whatever you ask God, he'll give it to you. And Jesus says, if you believe, and we get a confession from Martha. We talk about Peter's confession in Matthew 16. Do you ever think about the fact that the confession that Martha makes here is as profound as what Peter says in Matthew 16? You're the Messiah. You're the Son of God. She doesn't really know what Jesus can do there. She doesn't really understand that. But she does believe in Jesus. And I think we get a bit of a picture here with Mary and Martha and probably Lazarus as to why this family is so close to Jesus. Out of all the people that he deals with through his ministry, these may be the most refreshing, most open, most honest people. And that's got to count for a lot in a world of the skepticism and the bitterness and the hatred that he encounters among people that are supposed to be the people of God. And so she runs back and gets her sister Mary and tells her the Lord is here. And Mary is much the same way. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Out of people so close, you ever have somebody that's really close to you say one of those things that just kind of is really barbed and really pointed? It's kind of a reminder sometimes that people who shoot from the lip, even if they're a good person, can for that moment be very hurtful. And kind of that reminder that as God's people, we need to use our mouths for building, not tearing down, not for hurting. To have that restraint of not speaking. But Mary and Martha both shot from the lip. And so the scene moves to the place where Lazarus is buried. And I want you to think about what an amazing, life-changing, world-changing event this is. Some commentators point to this as what they call the final sign during the ministry of Jesus, obviously before his death. I would like to think of it as the ultimate one of, John is telling us about, well, who is Jesus? He's not just a rabbi or a teacher. Even Messiah, which is incredibly important to understand about him, that there is something much, much more that the people around him have not really come to grasp. And I want to just think for a second here about, there's kind of a parallel here to Jesus. And I'm not saying it is, or, but there's kind of a parallel in the sense that, we have, Jesus announces the death of Lazarus. In other words, that for the disciples, he foretells it before it is what happens. And foretold that he would be raised. You think about how important that is. One of the things we talk about when we look at the prophets in the Old Testament, that one of the things that's a very key idea is that what God does is that he tells his people what he's going to do, and then he does it. And Jesus is telling the disciples that, yeah, Lazarus is dead, but he's not going to stay dead. We see a picture of the compassion of Jesus. We focus on one passage here. It's that trivia question, right? What's the shortest verse in the Bible? Jesus wept. King James Version, I think, has "and." Jesus wept. But it says again, a few verses later, that he was again stirred in his heart. This is a heart-wrenching thing for Jesus, that we see how he responds to our grief and pain and suffering. he knows Lazarus is not going to stay dead. He knows he is going to go to the grave and call him out. So he's not weeping because Lazarus is dead, I don't think. Do you? He knows the story already. But I think he is responding to the heart of these people that he loves. And I always think that that is one of the most important things for us to remember, is that no matter what's happening to us, and no matter how much we are hurting, no matter how much we feel like we've just absolutely poured out our hearts in grief, that Jesus knows and understands and shares that with us. You know, as you think about maybe the darkest moment that you've ever experienced, to realize that. I remember, there's a song in our books. It says, "Does Jesus care when my heart is pained too deeply for mirth or song?" You know those moments where there's just seems like nothing is going to lighten us up. And Jesus knows and cares about that grief. And so as he's with Mary and Martha, and he sees their grief and their pain, he doesn't offer a platitude back at them, doesn't tell them they shouldn't feel that way. He knows that he's going to raise Lazarus, but he can sit and grieve with them a little bit. But then when he gets to the tomb and he tells them to roll back the stone, and a little amused at the statement there in a kind of a weird way, I guess, because what the response is, well, he's been in there for 4 days. He's already started to decompose. Why would you want to do that? But they do what Jesus asks them to do. They roll the stone away, and Jesus says, "Lazarus, come out." Now, I want you to imagine you're one of the people standing there. Maybe you're part of that crowd that's come out of Jerusalem and has followed Mary and Martha from the house because, you know, they think they're going to the graveside to mourn. And there's this guy that says, open the grave, and tells the guy in there, "Come out." What's interesting here, you know, as you watch attempts to portray this in the movies, there's always, from the time Jesus says this, there's always a dramatic pause. And then you see Lazarus start to appear. I don't know, I kind of like to think of the fact that when Jesus said it, he was right out that door, right out that opening. I always liked the statement, I think it was attributed to Marshall Keeble. Marshall Keeble was one of the great black evangelists of the 20th century in the U.S. He was just an incredibly humble man, but he was fiery. But his comment was, looking at this, is that Jesus said, "Lazarus, come out," because if he just said, "Come out," everybody would have. But that was the kind of faith that Marshall Keeble had. But imagine that moment when Lazarus appeared in the opening of that tomb. When what seemed like an impossibility became a reality, when the power of God showed, you know, and that's why I called this God at work. I mean, Jesus is real. Lazarus is real. And so the story unfolds really quite interesting because Jesus has said, I'm the resurrection and the life, He who believes in me will never die. The hope that Jesus offers, the reality. And so look at the responses that happen. Okay, you got Mary and Martha, and just think about how they would respond. Well, in chapter 12, Jesus comes back to visit Bethany again, and they has dinner at their house, and this is where Mary gets down and washes Jesus' feet and anoints them with the nard. Of the crowd, it says many put their faith in him. But there were some who saw this miracle, and what did they do? They went and told the Pharisees and the priests. Isn't that interesting? Now, I try to give them the benefit of the doubt and say, well, they went to tell them about this great miracle. But then what happens is the leadership gets together and starts to conspire to kill Jesus. Amazing response, isn't it? A world-changing event, a miracle unlike any other. One of the things is, we have two other accounts of Jesus raising the dead. We have the son of the widow of Nain. Jesus comes across outside Nain. They're carrying out to bury him. Jewish practice was to bury the dead pretty well immediately. It's the same day. We have the daughter, Jairus' daughter, where he's come to ask for healing, and then he gets word that his daughter is dead, and Jesus heals this girl from a distance. He comes back and finds his daughter alive and healthy. And a skeptic could look at both those stories and say, well, those are just resuscitation type events. We see that on ER every week. The story of Lazarus, he's been in the tomb for 4 days. There's no doubt about the fact he is dead. Jesus has raised him back to life. And that as people interact with Lazarus and as they see him and as they know what had happened, but what we find in here is a determined unbelief. That the circumstances were such that Jesus withdrew from Jerusalem, and so with the Passover coming, he heads back to Bethany, which is where the meal and the anointing happens. And it says there's a crowd that comes to see Jesus and Lazarus. Lazarus is the focus of attention now. And the leaders now say, well, then that means we not only have to kill Jesus, we've got to kill Lazarus. One of the things about this story that just really comes to mind is the fact that when people are determined not to believe, they are not going to believe. You can't make them believe. Sometimes somebody comes to me and says, I've got this friend, I so want to share with them. I would like to see them become a Christian. I think we have to recognize that idea that we cannot make anybody do anything. But there are many people that when they see the evidence, when they hear the story of Jesus, when they realize that, as he has talked about here, that he's the resurrection and the life. He is the one that just doesn't do these little miracle things for show, but they are evidences of his power, of who he is. He is the Son of God. He is the one who spoke and stilled the storm. He's the one who spoke and brought a man who had been dead and buried for 4 days back out and back to life. Historical tradition says Lazarus lived many years after, which is always kind of good to know. The Pharisees and leaders didn't get to him, despite their desire to. But to realize that this walking, living evidence of the power of the Son of God is just so amazing and so impressive. This story does foreshadow what's about to happen a few weeks later in Jerusalem. But it's important for us to realize that this is the one that we believe in. This is the one that we trust in. This is where we have put our hope as Christians. This is Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Let's stand as we sing.